Chronicles of the War of Souls book series. Book 1 Valerio, The Beginning of the End. Chapter 26. Roar over the abyss. They flew now in utter isolation, a small, sharp wedge honed like a spearhead, cleaving into the dense, advancing wall of twilight. It flowed down the slopes of the Dragon's Ridge in shades of violet, leaden gray, and ink-black shadows, swallowing details, transforming the world into the semblance of a giant. Grim engraving. The ridge itself loomed on all sides black, jagged giants crowned with the fangs of eternal snows against a deepening crimson sky. The wind, which before had only played in the deep ravines with a distant whistle, grew sharper, meaner, more biting. It no longer merely blew, it tore, lashed, flung handfuls of invisible icy needles into their faces. And now it carried from the east, from that very wound on the horizon, not just cold, but a clear, distinct, mind-searing smell of soot, as after a great fire, of bitter ash, and something else sour, metallic, profoundly alien and repulsive, that made the teeth clench involuntarily. It was the smell of corruption, the smell of what was pursuing them. It was this intensifying, howling, malice-filled nose of the wind, this roar and shriek of frenzy, air currents trapped in the stone corridors of the ravines, that drowned out the first, distant, yet achingly, memorably familiar sound. It broke through the roar of flight, not at once a thin, piercing, multiplied sound, cutting not only through ears, but through the soul, making everything inside clench tight. A shriek, the very one heard in nightmares. They simply hadn't noticed, hadn't had time to notice, how the previously motionless shadows on the ledges along the sides of the narrow, throat-like ravine, shadows that had merged with the rock, suddenly stirred, twitched, separated from the stone, took shape. There were so many of them. This stirring resembled the sudden seething of black, liquid pitch on the walls of the abyss. This was no prepared barrier, no coldly laid, classic ambush by a rational foe. It was a sudden, elemental, blind eruption of purest, feral hatred, tearing from the very bowels of the stone, from the dark source of the mountains, from behind razor-sharp peaks, from dark, gaping fissures, from lower, invisible ledges and niches. It surged and crashed down a living, thrashing, stinking avalanche in frantic convulsions. Hundreds of emaciated, bony bodies with gray, scabrous skin, with webbed, ragged wings like old sails shredded by a storm, and long, sickle-curved claws filthy, yellow, crafted by nature for one single purpose, to seize, cling, and tear living flesh to pieces. Harpies. The very word, surfacing in memory, was like that shriek. They had been drawn here by that far visible, unceasing bacchanal of preparation at Lendorn's borders, the continuous drone of thousands of voices, and the furious clang of forges, the strong, animal smells of multitudes of living creatures, the very unrest, the tremor of the sky from countless flights. They had waited patiently in their mountain caves, those stinking, bone-cluttered dens, and now their wild, pack-driven, merciless instinct pointed to the perfect, tempting prey. A small group of winged creatures, separated from the main herd, forever encroaching on their sky, their nests, their ugly, yet their own, lives. The attack was swift and deafening. The dry, sharp whistle of many scrawny bodies cutting the air merged into a piercing, multi-voiced chorus of shrieks, in which there was nothing human, only pure. Wild fury erupted from the stony depths. They fell from all sides at once, using the blindness of the cliffs, the suddenness, and their talent for being born as if from the very rock, from every crack, every shadow. There were so many that for a moment they blotted out the darkening sky, and the world for the small squad narrowed to a tangle of claws, membranes, bared moss, and mad eyes burning with a dull, poisonous greenish light like rotten phosphorescence in cave depths. The first crushing blow was taken by the hippogriff flying on the leftmost flank. Two harpies, driven by monstrous, inexplicable synchronicity, dug clawed feet into its powerful, beating wing. Bones cracked under the assault of thin, dry crunch like snapping branches. A third, smaller and more agile, darted like a wasp straight for the elven rider. He instinctively drew a short blade, and steel rang, deflecting a glancing strike at his throat. But his balance was lost, his body swayed, his foot hung for a moment in emptiness over the abyss. The hippogriff screamed, in pain and rage, a sound like iron scraping on stone. It began to tumble in the air, jerking desperately, trying to shake off the clinging creatures. And every movement sprayed dark drops of blood into the cold air. Circle, form the circle, a leer's cry, low and hoarse like the sound of a cracked war horn. broke through the general screech and clamor for an instant, but to form up, to create the familiar ground defense in this aerial whirlwind, was impossible. They were surrounded by a dense, seething ring. The air literally seethed with bodies screeching, spraying caustic spittle, reeking of carrion and damp stone, claws sharp as owls scratch, and grated against elven armor, snagged hippogriff feathers, tearing out clumps. A blinding screen of leathery wings, matted hair, and feathers obscured vision. To bow, a weapon of range, was useless in such close quarters. Chaos and arrow had no room to fly. Blades and short daggers came into play. The hippogriffs themselves struck with sharp, saber-like talons and worked mighty, crushing beaks, tearing scrawny flesh, grabbing and hurling away shrieking bundles of feathers and bone. But the harpies were countless. They pressed the assault, knowing no fear, blinded by a single thirst to rip apart, bite, drag away to their stinking nests hidden in the deepest, darkest clefts of the cliffs. Iviell, warding off a clawed shadow lunging for her face with short, chopping motions, glanced down at the leader. The colossal hippogriff now resembled the living heart of a raging storm. It thrashed in a small patch of air, and every movement was devastating. A sweep of its huge wing, like the blow of a giant club, knocked 2 or 3 harpies from flight at once. Its beak and claws tore flesh like rotten cloth, and dark spray flew in all directions, staining the air and rocks. But it, the largest and most dangerous, was assaulted by entire dozens, heedless of themselves. They clung to it like rotten, loathsome fruit, dug claws into its flanks, clung to its tail, trying with their combined weight to drag it down to the sharp, waiting stones of the ravine. Their scrawny bodies clung to it like parasites, and with every moment its movements grew heavier. Iviell, clinging to the trembling, foam-flecked neck of her terrified hippogriff, tried to close her eyes and concentrate. Her fingers frantically searched her shoulder bag for the warm, pulsing stone. She tried to unleash its blinding light to drive off the attacking foulness. But one of the harpies, slipping like a snake under her mouth's belly, yanked her from behind by her cloak. The fabric tore, her body jerked, and she barely held on, gripping handfuls of thick feathers, feeling the cold wind beat against her back and the void on below. Staying mounted in this whirlwind was a matter of leg strength and grip alone, and there was no certainty that next time she would find purchase. Each such jolt threatened to hurl her into the abyss. Iviell, pale as linen, her face frozen in an expression of cold resolve, couldn't use her bow. Arrows were useless in this seething mass of bodies. Instead, she wielded a short dagger, delivering quick, stabbing thrusts into the nearest gaping maws and lunging claws. Her movements were precise, and the blade sank with a dull thud into bony chest cavities. But for every one killed or wounded, new ones flew in, their eyes burning with the same wild madness, knowing no fatigue. Iviell fought in a state akin to dead water beneath fragile ice with the same lifeless, almost mechanical calm. Her blade, not long but perfectly balanced, traced not wide, sweeping arcs in the air, but short, precise, economical ones. Each had but one goal: to kill, one after another. In the blade's wake remained only spatters of dark, almost black, thick and sticky blood, and falling, contorted bodies that, spinning in the icy wind stream, vanished into the abyss. On her beautiful, cold face there was no shadow of fear, no flash of rage, only an empty, detached mask, behind which now lay pure, honed combat mechanics raised to the level of instinct. She seemed not to notice the deep scratches on her slender arms, not to feel the burning pain, for her consciousness, weary of horror, had retreated, yielding to the body that remembered every move, every joint and tendon's position, a body that knew its work without thought's involvement. Iviell, having lost his spear in the harpies' first assault, now fought with 2 short, agile elven blades. In the air, where there was no up or down, no rear or front, only a seething, hostile vortex from all sides, he could not literally shield Talos with his back. Instead, he tried to stay close to the druid's hippogriff, tracing fierce circles around it with his weapons, parrying the grabbing, tenacious lunges of harpies that aimed with particular frenzy at the unarmed rider. He fought without thought of danger, with the fury of a cornered beast defending its own, and his face was twisted not with fear, but with focused, silent rage. The druid, helpless in this aerial maelstrom, far from the quiet, earth-rooted strength of forests and river currents, merely clung with a death grip to the thick, sweat and wine-scented mane of his hippogriff. His eyes were wide open, but not with animal fear in them burned a fierce, silent, incredibly concentrated fire of observation. He read the overall pattern of the attack as he would read a pattern on leaves, or a beast's secret trail on forest soil, seeking hidden regularities, a weak link, a breach in this seeming chaos where others saw only confusion and blind terror. He saw not just individual screeching creatures, but the flock's collective movement, its twists and surges, like a stream of dirty water rushing down a channel, and the direction of this flow was as clear to him as a river's current. "They're herding us toward the ravine," he suddenly shouted, and his voice, usually quiet and measured like the rustle of an old book's pages, pierced the deafening din of battle, sharp and clear as a bell strike. "They're driving us into a trap." He was right. The fierce, seemingly senseless attacks of the Harpies, their lunges and recoils, their mad veers, were pushing the entire squad toward a narrow, dark cleft between two overhanging black crags, a place perfectly created by nature for a final slaughter, where their numerical advantage would become absolute, and the Hippogriffs' maneuvers impossible. This was not just an attack, it was a hunt with a drive, instinctive and ruthless, obeying ancient, dark laws of hunger and extermination. Iviell understood it in the same instant, and an icy, piercing clarity submerged her whole, like a sudden plunge into a mountain lake, momentarily drowning out the fiery, blinding storm of adrenaline. They wouldn't last here. The thought of perishing in this ravine, of their deaths becoming useless to all, just another line crossed out in the book of being, was more bitter than death itself. Warding off blows, she met the leader's gaze. In his golden, incredibly intelligent eyes, now framed by feathers bristling in pain and rage, she saw not just bestial anger, but the same cold, unerring understanding of hopelessness, and a mature, heavy resolution ripening within that clarity. The leader, gathering the last of its strength, made a sound she had never heard from it before, not a war cry, not a scream of pain, but a low, deep roar that vibrated in the very bone and shattered everything around, filling the air with ancient, primal power. It was a challenge thrown not just at enemies, but at fate itself, at death approaching on wings. A sound that for an instant overrode the deafening shrieks and made even these mad creatures shudder, eclipsing their blind fury with a spark of instinctive, primal terror before a force surpassing their own. Instead of continuing to fight on the spot, it suddenly surged forward, straight into the thickest part of the dense flock hanging over the narrow, bottleneck-like entrance to the fatal ravine. Its powerful charge, like a warship's ram, cleared a bloody, temporary breach in the living, hissing wall. It wasted no time killing each creature. It broke the very formation, sowing chaos and panic, drawing the fury of dozens of beaks and claws onto its own huge, bleeding frame. This was a calculation not of finesse, but of brute force, not of cunning, but of desperate sacrifice. "After me!" Iviell's cry, and her voice, usually so even and commanding, broke into a hoarse, throat-rending scream that held both the steel of command and bare, human plea. "Everyone, after us! Break through now!" It was a desperate, mad, but only chance, a thin crack in the stone wall of doom. The Hippogriffs, guided by ancient pack instinct and the iron will of their riders, rushed into the gaping passage, as if into a tunnel carved through the enemy's very flesh. They flew through a veritable hail of blows, through tenacious, grasping limbs reaching from the cliff's darkness, and the air around them hummed, filled with shrieks, the whistle of slashing wings, and the heavy wheeze of wounded beasts. It seemed the very mountain had collapsed upon them in the form of this living, hostile flesh. Iviell, covering the retreat and sacrificing his own balance, with a mighty, precise sweep of his blade hacked off the leathery wing of a harpy, aiming for Rhinal's unprotected back, and the creature, uttering a dying, inarticulate howl, plummeted like a stone, its short cry dissolving in the general whistle of wind. They burst from the stone vise, flying out onto a relatively open, windswept plateau where the air was not compressed by dark walls, and one could take at least one free, burning cold breath. That the Harpies, recovering from the surprise, with even greater, blind frenzy, having lost part of the flock but not their thirst for blood, gave chase. Their shrieks now sounded triumphant and hungry, mingling with the howl of wind in deep crevices, as if the mountain itself echoed their fury. And the leader, wounded, with alien, torn claws sticking from its sides like terrible ornaments, its feathers bloody clumps, now flew last, deliberately slowing, covering its squad's retreat with its own bleeding body. Together with Iviell, it became a shield, living and breathing. And the price of this shield was its hot blood, falling in heavy, scarlet drops from the height into the darkening, insatiable abyss of the ravine. Each sweep of its huge wings came with visible, agonizing effort, muscles rippling under the skin from strain, but their rhythm did not falter. It was the slow, sacrificial, inexorable rhythm of withdrawal, like the final beats of a huge, wounded heart. Rhynel, glancing over her shoulder, saw the dark, hissing river of creatures almost engulfing them, and her heart clenched in her chest with an icy, merciless hand of despair. They wouldn't make it in time, simply wouldn't have time to help. In her ears rang the whistle of wind and that piercing, triumphant shriek, and in her eyes froze the image, the huge, solitary, bleeding figure of the leader with Iviell still fighting on its back, her sword flashing. Against a backdrop of solid, seething darkness, they seemed an island amidst a raging black torrent that was about to swallow them whole. Each sweep of her blade, each desperate lunge was visible from a distant short. Fierce flashes of steel in the leaden gloom, futile attempts to ward off the inevitable. They had made this decision for their rescue, and now its price was being paid thus, on the wing, drop by drop, sweep by sweep. It was the arithmetic of sacrifice, merciless and simple. The retreat of a few was bought by standing to the death, and Rhynel, feeling the chill of anguish seep into her very bones, already saw in her mind how that island was extinguished, how the leader's huge body, pierced by dozens of claws, lost altitude and vanished into the boiling abyss below, taking with it that stubborn, desperate figure on its back. The thought stole her breath, and in that very moment, from that same impassive, icy height where hawks should have sailed with unhurried majesty under watchful guard, lightning struck down. Only it was not the blind lightning of the heavens. It was a griffin, huge, dark as a thundercloud before a deluge, and behind it, as if unchained from an invisible leash, another, and another, and another. Not a pathetic dozen, but perhaps a full 50. Those very griffins meant to guard the slow, majestic convoy. They dove down with mute, crushing, absolute fury, true masters of the aerial crags, falling upon the harpy flock from behind and the flanks where they least expected it, where their blind fury saw no threat. Their assault was unlike the wild, chaotic melee. It was a working mechanism, a falling hammer, inexorable and precise, powerful, stone-shattering beaks and claws, made for hunting mountain goats and wyverns, crunched fragile bones and tore scrawny flesh with barely visible effort, like dry reeds under a boulder's weight. They did not engage in a general, protracted brawl. They methodically, coldly sliced the flock into parts, tore its living fabric, turning the harpies' wild fury into blind, panicked flight, into pure, animal terror. The air hung not only with shrieks and crunches, but with a smell sharp, coppery, the smell of sudden and absolute slaughter. The harpies, suddenly faced with a force against which their pack tactics and numbers proved pitiful and useless, falter, and their fighting spirit burst like a soap bubble, leaving nothing but the stench of fear. Their triumphant shrieks changed to piercing, frightened cries of pure terror. Unfamiliar to them before, they began to scatter, darting blindly, trying helplessly and chaotically to hide in familiar, narrow crevices from which they had so confidently and fiercely flown out to hunt. But now those fissures became traps where they squeezed in, breaking wings and leaving scraps of skin on sharp stones. Among these diving, merciless giants, Iviell, to her profound astonishment, recognized one figure, not the largest, but with a particular, harsh, well-remembered crook in one wing. It was one of the griffin leaders that had sat on the crag beside the Lord of the Crags himself, and it flew now not merely to kill and scatter it purposefully, like a honed arrow, cut through the thicket of milling bodies straight to where she and the leader of the Hippogriffs still fought with their last strength. Its movements were devoid of fuss. Each wingbeat, each turn of the head served one goal: to clear a path. A few moments later, the furious melee around them subsided, as if washed away by a clean, cold wave, purified by the fierce and precise intervention of the newcomers from on high. The wounded, blood-covered hippogriff, breathing heavily and raggedly, still miraculously held its place in the thin air, instinctively fending off the last, most stubborn creatures. The griffin, making a short, swift reconnaissance circle around it, drew close, taking a position slightly to the side and above, covering it with its body. They exchanged no sounds, no nods, no signs understandable to elves. For one short but infinitely significant moment, their gazes met, intelligent, suffering amber and cold, assessing gold, and, in that instant, silent meeting, was a mutual, profound understanding of all the terrible price paid for straying from the original, measured plan, and a deepest, bestial respect for the steadfastness shown, for the spirit unbroken by pain and numbers. It was a conversation in a language older than any elven tongue, the language of mountains, height, and spilled blood. Iviell felt the tremor long held back by the numbness of battle begin to break through every muscle. A cold, relentless wave of fatigue and awareness of all the pain endured. Her hand rose sharply, jerkily, as if still parrying a blow, a sign wordlessly understood by her battered, exhausted to the limit Hippogriff land. On that dark, uneven spur of rock jutting from the mountain's body like a broken tooth, they crashed onto the stone, not descended, and the stone met them with cold, hard, implacable reality. Safety, was it? Only for this short, hard-won time, bought with blood and fury. The Harpies, so recently a dense, hissing cloud blotting the sky, now scattered in the thickening twilight, pursued by Griffins. They finished them off with cold, methodical cruelty, not as warriors fighting for honor, but as predators cleansing their territory of carrion. In the thin, icy air hung a heavy, cloyingly sweet smell of fresh blood, mingling with the sharp reek of torn entrails, dust, and eternal stone. The silence after the deafening din of battle was ringing, tense, almost unbearable, as if the very sky held its breath, listening to the last gasps of the dying. She slid from the leader's back, and her legs, accustomed to firm, reliable earth, shook and buckled. The long tension of flight and battle, the adrenaline that had flowed like a fiery river in her veins, all receded at once, leaving behind a chilling, draining weakness. Every muscle ached, and joints creaked like rusty hinges. First him, the leader, its mighty, once perfect side now rose and fell with heavy, rasping, ragged movements. Each breath came with visible strain. Its high, bronze and iridescent on other days, was now striped with dark trails of congealed blood, studded with ragged, oozing wounds. From the deepest, on its ribs, a pulsing, scarlet fluid seeped, dripping onto the gray stone with a quiet, measured sound, the countdown of a huge heart's last strength. But life still clung to it with the stubbornness of mountain rock itself, wild and unwilling to yield toward it, forgetting their own scrapes and bruises, the pain in dislocated shoulders and scratched faces. Iviell and Reinald already ran. Their swift, deft hands rummaged in saddlebags, pulling out precious jars of thick balm smelling of bitter wormwood, forest mint, and sweet, viscous honey, and rolls of clean, white, blood-and-touch bandages. Their expressions, usually so different, one focused and stern, the other with a hint of mockery at the lips' corners, were now the same. Furrowed brows, tight lips, eyes full of anxious concentration. Even the air around that Hippogriff seemed thickened with conflicting scents, astringent healing bitterness, sweet spiciness, and the sharp, warm, iron tang of blood. Iviell dropped to her knees, heedless of the sharp stones digging into flesh. Her fingers, slender and strong, carefully probed the edges of the worst wound, and the leader, even in its half-stupor, shuddered deeply but did not pull away. She looked into its eyes, those intelligent, amber mirrors now clouded with pain and weariness. There was no fear in them, only stern, animal endurance and a deep, silent exhaustion. "Hold on, giant," she whispered, and her voice, usually clear, sounded muffled and hoarse. "Hold on. This isn't the end yet." Reinald, meanwhile, with quick, practiced motions, was already unwrapping bandages. She applied a thick layer of balm to the torn edges of flesh, and the leader shuddered again, emitting a short, choked sound like a groan, but then fell silent, as if ashamed of its weakness. Iviell slowly, with effort, raised her eyes, staring into the darkening, fathomless heights. High above, barely discernible in the night's blue, sailed the impassive, huge silhouettes of the hawks with their cargo, and above them, like dark, inexorable, perfect sentinels, flew the slender, sharp wedges of griffins, slowly, with cold dignity, at their own altitudes. The entire gigantic aerial convoy had not paused for a second, not faltered in its majestic, unhurried progress. Their small, desperate, bloody skirmish below, among cliffs and shrieks, was for that colossal aerial armada but a minor, almost unnoticed ripple on the surface of a deep and inexorable ocean of events, unnoticed in the grand movement toward a distant, terrible goal. And the sight, this calm, indifferent grandeur, made the chill in her soul deepen. To their rocky perch, cleaving the air with powerful sweeps of huge wings, smooth as a great ship docking at a desolate shore, landed the Griffin leader, the one who had come to their aid. Its coarse, sandy brown fur on shoulders and mighty chest was thickly spattered with the black, sticky, already congealing blood of Harpies, and on one of its terrible, curved claws hung a pointless scrap of dirty, membranous wing, a trophy of no worth to it. It fixed Iviell with its unblinking, lidless gaze, and in its narrow, yellow eyes with vertical, snake-like pupils was no hint of reproach for their willfulness and separation. No silent question about the cause. There was only a cold, unerringly analytical, assessing stare of an ancient predator and warrior, weighing on invisible scales his losses, the remaining threats, and the next necessary action in this bloody game. Iviell met this bestial gaze yellow, with a vertical pupil, lidless and thus seeming ever wakeful, ever cessing. It held no human warmth, not even a glimmer of that simple understanding that lived in her hippogriff's eyes. This was the depth of an ancient, alien intellect, subordinate to different laws: survival, territory, brute force, and cold calculation. She found no words in her emptied mind, no gratitude, which would have seemed a petty coin tossed into a bottomless well for what had just transpired, no justifications for breaking away, for attracting trouble. Her thoughts were slow and viscous, a sap oozing from a wounded tree. She merely nodded, briefly, almost weightlessly, a movement barely noticeable under the burden of weariness hanging on her shoulders. But in that nod was everything. Acknowledgement. Acknowledgement of the price paid in the ravine's darkness with dark blood. Acknowledgement of that harsh arithmetic governing this world. This was not pity, not mercy born under a changeable sky. This was the fulfillment of a contract. Severe, literal, to the last line, to the last drop. The Griffins had taken on guarding the convoy. Their squad, having broken away, drawing themselves into a furious swarm of Harpies, had become a threat to that convoy, a threat diverting and expending the guard's strength. The threat had been detected, and ruthlessly, with predatory efficiency, neutralized. It was all simple, clear, logical, without unnecessary, superfluous feeling, as if war itself, cold and calculating, was already dictating its inexorable loss. She slowly, overcoming the ache in her body, turned to her battered squad, to the wounded, breathing with effort but alive, infinitely dear comrades, to Talos limping but leaning heavily on his simple wooden staff, inwardly unbroken, undefeated, to Quendeler pale as moonlight on snow, a preserving in the depths of his eyes a firm, unshakable, rock-like calm. They stood, leaning on each other or on their exhausted hippogriffs, and in their silence, in their weary postures, was read not mere fatigue, but a deep, jointly endured trauma, a scar on the soul that would now be part of them all. They silently watched her, and in that gaze was a question, expectation of an order, readiness to rise and fly again, though their bodies begged for only one thing: to collapse on the cold stone and not move. Bind the wounds, do what we can. Let the hippogriffs catch their breath, but we can't linger long, she said, and her voice, after a moment's hoarseness, regained its usual, steely, uncompromising clarity. Then we fly on, to catch up. Now we know for sure they won't leave us to be torn apart. The silence that settled on the rocky spur was fragile, precarious, and deeply deceptive, like the thinnest, transparent film of ice stretched over bowing, about to explode water. The air, just now torn to shreds by shrieks and the ring of steel, now hummed with a low, distant, almost ghostly rhythm, measured, gigantic beat of hundreds, thousands of wings of the slowly receding aerial caravan. The echo of that great armada gradually dissolved into the mountains, absorbed by stone, leaving them in a ringing, anxious, oppressive emptiness where only the whistle of wind in ravines was heard. Some time later, Iviell stood at the very edge of the plateau, not turning to her own, and looked not down into the abyss, but up into the thickening sky, not at the ominous, pulsing glow hidden behind tattered clouds in the east, but at the black, sharp silhouettes tracing low, vigilant, patrol circles right over their heads. A dozen griffins, left as a mute yet tangible guarantee of safety. They soared almost soundlessly, their golden, unblinking eyes with vertical pupils ceaselessly, methodically scanning every dark crevice, every overhanging ledge, every moving shadow in the darkness. Their presence, in theory, should have been reassuring, but it only underscored with cruel clarity how vulnerable, small, and cut off from their flock they, the elves and their sky steeds, were here. Talos, leaning his back against the cold, warmth-absorbing stone, closed his eyes, gripping his staff tightly, into whose crystal now only a tired green light flickered occasionally. He did not listen to the howling wind. He listened to the silence itself, to the sounds born beneath it. And in that deceptive silence, he began to discern something else, alien, a light, scrabbling, multiplied stirring inside the very thickness of the rock, a dry sound like rustle of many claws on rough granite, coming not from above, but from the depths of dark, gaping fissures at the base of their ledge, as if the stone bowels, the very flesh of the mountain, were scratching and stirring from within, preparing to erupt. He opened his eyes, and his gaze immediately met that of Iviell, standing guard nearby. The Gar, leaning on his bare, already clean blade, had also frozen in a tense pose, and his steel eyes, accustomed to danger, were fixed not on the majestic sentinels in the sky, but on the black, bottomless maw of the nearest narrow ravine, from which this stirring seemed to emanate. Between them, silently, flashed a quick, spark-like moment of complete and unerring understanding. What was preparing would not be a furious but chaotic attack by an enraged beast. This was something else, purposeful, controlled. Iviell, the druid's voice sounded quietly, almost a whisper, but with such distinct, sharp alarm that she turned to him instantly, her whole body sensing new trouble. And in that same moment, as if confirming his foreboding, the Griffins patrolling above them abruptly, synchronously changed the pattern of their flight. Their smooth, unhurried circles shifted to sharp, jerky, almost convulsive veers. One of them, flying the lowest, suddenly emitted not its usual bass roar, but a short, piercing, metallic cry sound like a steel blade striking stone, a signal of alarm and readiness for battle. And from all the surrounding dark fissures, from under overhanging ledges, as if the mountain itself, unable to bear it, spewed forth a new, poisonous flow from its hidden pores. A second wave poured onto the plateau, smaller in number than the first, but frighteningly disciplined, organized. These harpies did not fly in a blind, unstoppable avalanche. They moved in short, precise, coordinated bursts, using every rocky outcrop as cover, every shadow as an invisibility cloak, every irregularity of terrain for concealment. Their single, clear goal was readable in the synchronicity of their maneuvers. First, destroy or drive off the aerial patrol, then cut off the prey's every escape route, and finally, quickly and mercilessly finish off the wounded, cornered quarry on the open plateau. They were not just attacking. They were learning from the first flock's mistakes. Or, what was more terrifying, someone was directing them. 3 Griffins from the patrol, without hesitation, dove to meet the first, largest group of attackers, creating a deadly whirlwind of feathers, claws, and torn flesh in the air above the plateau. But the main mass of the creatures, cleverly avoiding direct confrontation with the mighty sentinels, fell as one cohesive stream from different sides directly onto that scrap of level stone, where the elves huddled. To the wall. Press your backs to the cliff, Iviell barked, and his hoarse, throat-rending voice again sliced through the rising, piercing shrieks. To defend in the middle of an open, almost surrounded area was pure suicide. As one, they rushed toward the nearest cliff face, trying to create at least some defense for their backs. The hippogriffs, snorting in pain and rage, rearing up, instinctively formed a living, breathing ring of bodies, beaks, and claws, in whose trembling center remained the most vulnerable those who couldn't move quickly. Iviell, forgetting her own safety, the deep scratch on her arm, and that her stone was meant for healing, not attack, frantically raised her glowing, warm to the touch stone high over her head. A blinding, painfully white, eye-searing flash, like a tiny lightning bolt, illuminated the whole plateau for an instant, casting sharp, black shadows from every stone. Several harpies caught in the epicenter of this sudden light howled, covering their sensitive eyes with bony paws, completely disoriented in the air. But one, larger and more cunning than the rest, with dirty feathers the color of old rust-tanned dry blood, slipped not from above, but from the side, darting nimbly under the belly of her own alert hippogriff, already exhausted from the previous fight. With a bandaged wing, it jerked aside in fright, trying to strike the uninvited guest with a powerful taloned foot. But the harpy was swift, precise, and merciless as death itself. Its long, bony, curved claws didn't even aim for the elf. They crunched and whistled as they sank into the hippogriff right at the base of its powerful wing, into the most vulnerable, delicate nexus of tendons, ligaments, and fragile bones, covered only by thin skin and soft feathers. A repulsive, wet, not loud but distinct crunch sounded, the sound of breaking bones and tearing tendons, like a dry branch snapping under winter's weight. This crunch was immediately drowned by a scream of unbearable, animal pain, ripped from the very depths of the noble beast's throat, a scream in which there was nothing of irrational being, only pure, primal agony of torn flesh. This sound was more terrible than any battle cry, for in it was heard not a furious denial of death, but its unconditional, slow triumph. Ivell's hippogriff didn't just fall or stumble, crippled by that treacherous, maiming blow aimed at the most vulnerable point where bone met joint, under thin layers of skin and feathers. It instinctively did the last thing it could for her. Its body, still obeying will, not all-consuming pain, with a sharp, powerful movement hurled her aside with its flank, trying to save her from the Harpies' claws. It was a final act of devotion, a gesture born not of thought, but of the ancient bond between rider and mount. It itself, unable to cope with the suddenly disrupted balance and no longer in control of one wing, which now hung lifeless like a broken mast, crashed onto the very edge of the stone platform. And then it fell, down into a narrow, dark, grave-like fissure between two crags, vanishing into darkness, only a last sweep of its healthy wings slowing the fall for a moment, like a farewell gesture. Iviell hit the stones of the plateau, rolled over sharp, blade-like fragments, and lay still, uttering no sound, no moan. Air left her lungs in one silent, agonizing spasm, and the world narrowed for a moment to a white flash of pain in the back of her head, and the salty taste of blood on her lips. From below, from the black, bottomless darkness of the rift, for a few more seconds came ragged, intermittent, convulsive gasps and a dull, powerless clatter of hooves on slippery stone. Final, doomed attempts to rise, touching in their desperation. Then came complete, final silence, that special silence that follows the passing of a great life. Only the wind, eternal denizen of the mountains, cold and indifferent, howled in that ravine where now lay the broken body of her faithful steed, with a wing forever broken and a shattered back. Iviell, fending off a furious assault from two Harpies darting before her, saw this scene only from the corner of her eye, but it was enough. An icy, searing wave rolled through all her veins, freezing movement for an instant. No. Not her. Not Iviell. Not now. Not after everything. With a desperate, supreme effort of will, she drove her blade into the twisted throat of one creature, ripped it free, and, shoving the second aside, tore across the plateau, through the chaos and blood, to where the other lay. Above them, in the sky, raged a frantic battle between the remaining Griffins and the main, organized forces of the Harpies. But even the iron discipline and overwhelming might of the winged lords of the mountains had cracked. The enemies, sparing not themselves, thinking not of survival, threw themselves into the assault not for honest victory, but for a single, soul strike. They swarmed over the giant, strong bodies like living, stinking moss and clung to the bases of mighty wings. One griffin, entangled from head to foot by a dozen clinging bodies, couldn't pull out of a steep dive in time, and crashed into a sheer cliff with a deafening, avalanche-like roar, dragging all its tormentors into the bottomless abyss. A second, the youngest and most hot-blooded, was dragged into a narrow, slit-like fissure where its colossal strength became a death trap. It was simply crushed against the stones by its own mass and the mass of the swarming creatures. A third, losing altitude in this unequal, exhausting struggle, was beaten down to the ground and, on the stones, unable to take flight, was quickly and brutally torn apart. The 10 sentinels dwindled before their eyes like ice in the sun. Their aerial cover, seeming so reliable, crumbled with terrible speed. And then the leader of the Hippogriffs, bleeding dark blood from a deep, gaping wound in its side, made its decision. It did not soar up to aid the dying allies. It, gathering the remnants of its strength and leading 3 or 4 of the toughest, surviving kin, charged along the very ground, over the stones of the plateau, straight at that dense mass of Harpies, besieging the Elves at the cliff. Its attack was not a battle, but a hurricane of pure rage and last desperation. Its powerful, hammer-like hooves and terrible, crushing beak shatter, broke, scattered the bony, light bodies in all directions. Under its lead, several hippogriffs, forgetting pain, created a temporary, bloody breach in the siege ring, giving the exhausted Griffins a respite and drawing onto themselves a significant part of the deadly onslaught. Iviell, meanwhile, fell to her knees beside the motionless, small form of Iviell. The healer lay on her side, in an unnatural pose, her face waxen pale, her breathing shallow, ragged, and hoarse. Iviell's trembling but firm fingers found the weak pulse of life at her cold neck. "Hold on," she whispered, leaning close to Iviell's ear, not knowing if the other could hear in this twilight between life and death. Iviell raised her eyes, and her gaze swept across the battlefield, revealing a truly grim and hopeless picture. 3 huge bodies of Griffins, dark and majestic, already lay motionless on the stones like mountain giants cast down from the heavens. One hung over the ledge, its wing lifelessly drooping like a torn banner after battle. Those still holding in the air were wounded and exhausted, their feathers, once gleaming with gold and bronze, now matted with blood and dust. They fought back with their last strength, but the ring of harpies closed around them, ever tighter, like a living, hissing constrictor. Even the hippogriffs, led by the wounded but furious leader, its mane bristling like the battle mane of an enraged lion, could not hold back this pressure. Step by step, losing blood-sodden patches of ground beneath them, they retreated toward the cliff, toward the cold, merciless stone that could become their last refuge or common grave. Talos, pressed back against the rough, cold-absorbing surface of the cliff, gripped his staff until his knuckles whitened. De Woe, accustomed to the warmth of his palm, now felt icy and alien. His eyes were closed, but not from fear. Fear was a luxury for which he had no strength left but from extreme, almost inhuman concentration. His lips, cracked from wind and strain, whispered not spells, but words of search, quiet and insistent, as if he were probing with his fingers the pattern on ancient tree bark, trying amidst the chaos of death, to deafening shrieks and gasps, to find a weakness, the slightest crack in the monolith of the enemy's will, that very thing, invisible thread by which he could pull himself and the others from this bloody mire. Leader, Iviell, he suddenly cried out, and his voice, usually quiet and measured like the rustle of leaves on a windless day, sounded with unexpected, piercing force, overriding the general din for an instant. In that cry was something of a raptor's call, of a warning shout from an old forest warden. The gray one, large, with a scar across its eye, on the separate ledge to the left. It's not fighting, it's giving orders. Look, Iviell's gaze, sharp and detail-catching even in this hell, instantly, almost without thought, found the indicated target, on a distant, solitary, high rock tooth, away from the main melee, indeed perched, lurking in shadow, a large harpy. Its feathers were the color of old ash and scorched earth, and across one eye ran a deep, whitish scar like a claw mark. It did not fling itself into the general fray. Its ugly, hunched head with quick, gleaming, black-bead eyes constantly turned, watching the whole battlefield with cold, predatory calculation. Its thin, curved, sickle-like beak was constantly slightly open, and from the barely perceptible movements of its throat, the twitching of its membranous wings among its retinue, it was clear it was issuing commands inaudible in the general deafening clamor, that sharp as a dagger strike, directing streams of its creatures where the defense weakened. A thought, desperate and clear as a blade, matured in Iviell's mind instantly, without hesitation. It was not a tactical subtlety, it was the instinct of a cornered beast ready to risk everything for one lethal leap. Orlin, to me, into the air, she commanded, and in her voice, torn from shouting, was not a request but an order forged in battle's crucible. Without wasting a fraction of a second, she leaped onto the first hippogriff at hand, not her own, but one of the survivors, its hide crisscrossed with fresh scratches. The beast, sensing the iron resolve and fury of its rider, obediently crouched, explaining nothing more, and without looking back at the others, whose faces had become masks of despair and hope, she directed it sharply not into the thick of battle, but along the very edge of the plateau. Her hippogriff surged forward in a low, swift, almost silent flight, its huge, wounded wingtips nearly brushing the sharp outcrops of stone, as if death itself breathed down its neck. Iviell and Orlin, without a moment's hesitation, without asking unnecessary questions, leaped onto their own exhausted hippogriffs and followed her, breaking away from the general ring of defense, rushing into the gaping maw of danger. The harpies, possessing some pack-like, almost telepathic sense, sensed this maneuver almost at once. Part of them, the most agile and cunning, with sharp, grating cries broke off from the exhausting attacks on the griffins and remaining defenders, and gave chase, weaving zigzags in the cold air like a flock of hungry black arrows. But Iviell, gritting her teeth until they hurt, paid no heed to the pursuers. All her being, all her will was focused on one goal, that rocktooth where the gray leader perched. She led her tiny detachment straight at it, like an arrow loosed from a taut bow flying toward its target through a storm. The scarred harpy saw their approach. In its tiny, glittering eyes full of wild, predatory intelligence flashed not fear, but swift, cold calculation, like that of an old wolf driving prey. It did not panic. As if released by an invisible spring, it tore from the ledge not downward to safety, but forward, to meet them, Masterfully gathering speed in a short, almost vertical dive, it rushed to meet them, leading a select, ferocious handful of the largest and most vicious harpies, their claws gleaming like dirty yellow daggers. Iviell, not slowing, drew the string of her long elven bow. The supple wood bent in her hands, a familiar and living curve whispering of thousands of other shots, of the silence of Lendorn's forests. The arrow, slender and sharp, with feathers touched by frost, whistled through the thickening, cry-filled air and sank true into the wing membrane of the nearest harpy in the retinue. That one, shrieking like the grinding of rusty gates, tumbled, lost altitude, and vanished into the gray veil below. Iviell, flying to the left, met another creature diving at him from above, not with a wide sweep, but with a short, chopping, branch-splitting stroke of his elven blade. Steel flashed, and a clawed, tenacious paw flew aside, and the harpy, choking on its own cry, crashed onto the stones. Iviell, barely keeping his balance on his wounded, jerking hippogriff, shot from the hip. The arrow, loosed almost without aim, with a dull thud pierced through the bony chest of a third harpy, which folded like a broken toy and silently fell into the abyss. But they were only 3, and the harpies in this welcoming group numbered more than a dozen, and the flock's leader itself, the gray beast, was already in its last, lethal leap. Its long, hook-like, yatagan claws were aimed straight at Iviell, at her face, throat, chest, where beneath her armor beat a heart full of rage and despair. Air whistled around its scrawny body, the stench of carrion and damp stone reaching Iviell, sharp and repulsive. And then 2 of the 7 remaining living griffins, as if reading her desperate, unspoken design through the chaos of battle and the roar of wind, performed a last, sacrificial, incredible maneuver. With a thundering, deathly roar that drowned all sounds for an instant, shrieks, steel's ring, groans, they swept low over the very cliffs, their shadows sliding over the stones like shadows of giant, falling stars. They crashed, like to black, living lightning bolts, straight into the gray harpy and its dense, clawed guard. The first griffin, already bleeding from a ragged wound in its side, with its mighty, rock-like body knocked the leader off its precise, murderous course, immediately becoming entangled in a knot of its clinging retinue. Harpy claws dug into its hide, tore feathers, but it no longer heeded this. The second, risking being torn apart the next instant, struck the leading harpy from the side with all the crushing might of its bony wing. A dull, repulsive crunch sounded, like dry twigs breaking, and the scrawny, bony body of the leader twisted in an unnatural arc, a piercing, furious, pain and frenzy-filled shriek, more like iron grinding on stone, tore over the entire battlefield, momentarily silencing and stunning its whole wild, frenzied flock. In that sound was not just pain, but the collapse of will, the ruin of a predatory mind. This instant, this moment, was enough. Enough for Iviell, finding herself just a few yards from the tangled, fighting, falling knot of bodies and feathers, to release the bowstring. The arrow, loosed with such force that the string left bloody stripes on her fingers, stripping skin, whistled its short path and flew straight into the open, silently screaming maw of the gray harpy. The point vanished deep into the throat, into dark, gurgling flesh. The shriek cut off at its highest pitch, turning into a bubbling, choking rattle. The creature, jerking in wild, disordered death throes, ceased to be a predator, became just a piece of falling flesh. It plummeted like a stone, down onto the sharp, waiting stones at the foot of its own crag. And there it lay, small and pitiful against the majestic cliffs. With the leader's death, an instantaneous, almost magical transformation occur in the harpy flock. That coordinated, cruel, precise assault that had squeezed the elves and their allies in a steel vice fell apart like a house of cards under a breath of icy wind. They milled about, losing common direction and that blind, pack-driven will that had guided them. In its place rose simply a bunch of frightened, vicious creatures. They began to retreat chaotically, dart, crash into each other, hiding in familiar dark slits and crevices, as if an invisible hand holding them taut as bowstring suddenly unclenched its fingers. Iviell's pursuers also faltered, their onslaught weakened, fury replaced by bewilderment, then fear. After a few more furious, but now senseless, purposeless lunges, they began to retreat after the others, dissolving into darkness, their shrieks now sounding not a threat, but the panicked, piercing wail of a scatter herd. The battle, that all-consuming whirlwind of feathers and fury, subsided almost as suddenly as it had fallen upon them. In place of the deafening shrieks came silence, not peaceful, but heavy, thick, and oppressive, as if the very cliffs had absorbed all the screaming and now could not exhale it. It was broken only by sounds that froze the blood. The ragged, labored breathing of the wounded, the bubbling, gurgling death rattle of one of the griffins, the choked, animal moans of hippogriffs trying to rise on trembling legs. The air hung motionless, saturated with the coppery smell of blood, the acrid stench of torn entrails, and dust churned up by hooves and wings. Iviell slowly, as if moved by another's will, lowered her bow. The string went slack without a sound. Her hands did not tremble, they were cold and damp, with sweat mixed with others and her own blood, and lay still as to stone-hewn blocks, forgetful of their strength. She forced herself to survey the battlefield, and that picture etched itself into her memory forever. Every ghastly stroke, every detail of grief and loss. To Griffins, miraculously surviving the last, sacrificial attack, heavy, with difficulty, as if overcoming unbearable weight, settled onto the stones near the other surviving kin. From numerous, ragged wounds on their mighty bodies oozed dark, almost black blood, slowly spreading over the gray stone, seeping into it like into a voracious sponge. Another, the youngest, with feathers not yet acquainted with all the harshness of the peaks, quietly bled from a wound in its side. Its golden eye, which so recently had danced with reflections of fury, had already dulled and filmed over with the veil of approaching darkness. Ivell's hippogriff was dead. Its body with the broken wing lay in the abyss, and the cold wind stirred clumps of its once gleaming mane. Iviell herself lay unconscious not far away, pale as linen, on which only shadows of bruises and abrasions showed. Two other hippogriffs, gravely wounded, could not rise, their mighty bodies shuddering with every attempt to move. Talos and Quendeler, pressed against the cold, rough stone of the cliff, were alive, but it was a life marked by deep weariness and pain, their faces and hands covered in scratches and sticky dust mixed with blood. Rhinal, weeping soundlessly, her whole body shuddering, herself covered in blood. Others and her own was already crawling toward Ivell's motionless form. Her fingers, usually so deft and sure, now trembled, sliding helplessly over bloodied cloth, trying to find some point of support, the slightest sign of life. They had held, miraculously, that the price of this victory, if it could be called victory, scorched the soul, lay on their shoulders as an unliftable, cold burden they would have to carry onward. Griffins, those proud, alien, and unassailable lords of the sky crags, had fallen here, on this forgotten by all plateau. They had fallen defending them, beings of another people, another blood. Iviell, overcoming the ache in every joint, jumped down from her hippogriff's back. Her legs, accustomed to feeling firm, reliable earth beneath them, buckled for a moment, and she barely kept her balance, leaning against the hot, trembling flank of her mount. Then, staggering as if after a long illness, she moved toward that young griffin lying closest, grievously wounded and already not clinging to the remnants of life. It lay on its side, its mighty body covered in matted, brownish fur heaving intermittently and heavily, its golden eye, already losing its falcon bright gleam, and clouded with a murky film, looked at her without a trace of fear, without reproach for the trouble brought, and it was only infinite, weary clarity, such as an old, battle-seasoned warrior has, who knows his end and accepts it without complaint. From a deep, gaping wound in its side, from which, like terrible trophies, protruded fragments of others' claws, dark, thick, almost black blood oozed profusely, pulsing in time with its barely audible heartbeat. It spread over the stones, forming a sticky, slowly growing pool beneath its body. Not thinking of danger, not fearing a last, reflexive blow from a mighty wing, Iviell knelt before it. Sharp stones dug into her flesh, but that pain was insignificant. She placed her small, blood and filth-smeared hand on its powerful chest, caked with dust and congealed blood. Beneath the thick, coarse fur she felt weak, rhythmic, ever-fading beats of a huge, wounded heart. It was a slow, heavy thud, counting out the last moments of life, a thud that made her own heart clench in her chest. The young griffin made a short, gurgling sound, not like a moan or a complaint, but like a deep, wet sigh. There was no suffering in it, only a statement, a final accounting to itself and the world of duty fulfilled. Then its golden, clouding eye fixed, staring at some point in the void above her, and moved no more. The heart beating beneath her palm measured out a few more slow, ever weaker beats. One, another, a third. The interval between them stretched, became unbearably long. Then came silence, complete, all-encompassing, terrible silence. The heavy muscle under her hand twitched one last time, and stilled. It beat no more. She did not weep. She simply knelt in a pool of another's, still warm blood, under the low, black sky, and felt the unbearable weight of these noble, alien lives given for them settle on her shoulders, pour into her soul. They had not yet even entered the real, great war, but were already bearing the first, terrible and irreplaceable loss. The silence after the battle was thick, sticky, saturated with the smell of blood, torn entrails, dust, and animal fear. But it did not last long. Perhaps a few heavy breaths, the wind, lashing, piercing, cold as a knife blade, carried from distant peaks a new, achingly familiar sound, distant, but multiplying, merging into one stream of shrieks. Another flock, larger, hungrier, drawn by the smell of fresh battle and blood, it already circled somewhere beyond the ridges, waiting for the right moment to fall upon the weakened, bleeding quarry. Iviell slowly, with effort, tore her palm from the cooling, coarse-furred chest of the griffin and rose to her feet. Her face, usually beautiful and expressive, was now an impassive mask of dried grime, sweat, and congealed spatters of others and her own blood. The next wave is already close. We won't survive another such encounter here. We need to leave this plateau. Now. Her voice sounded low, hoarse from strain, but with the same inexorable steely clarity as always, leaving no room for doubt. Iviell, bandaging his forearm with a bloody scrap of cloth, only nodded grimly, his stern, wrinkled face grown darker and more hopeless. Orlin, helping to restrain a pain and fear-shuddering hippogriff, looked up anxiously, almost instinctively, at the sky, at that ridge from which the sounds came. But Iviell began, not taking her bloody but firm hands from the elf maid's chest. Her fingers, no longer trembling, worked quickly and professionally. She felt for damaged ribs, applied a tight, pressure bandage from a torn cloak, trying to immobilize a possible fracture or simply stop internal bleeding. She won't survive the jolting in flight. She can't even be shaken hard, or else she didn't finish. Ball understood. Then she will be carried, without shaking, like a fragile vase, Talos said firmly. He approached, leaning heavily on his staff, his face gray with weariness and the reasserted pain in his leg. But his gaze remained clear and focused. He looked over the surviving but wounded griffins. 6 remained. 4, including the 2 who had taken part in the last, sacrificial attack, sat or lay, breathing heavily, licking wounds, unable to rise. The other 2, slightly less injured but also covered in fresh, shallow wounds, stood alert, their golden, unblinking eyes fixed on that same ridge from which the ominous sounds came. They can carry, carefully, as prey carried to a nest. They are strong, even wounded their paws can hold without causing unnecessary suffering. It's our only chance. The idea was insane, absurd, contrary to the very nature of these beings. Griffins were never beasts of burden, docile carriers. They were apex predators, undisputed lords of their crags, formidable and self-sufficient battle units, whose will was bound not by bridle, but by their own choice and strength. That the harsh, bare reality, saturated with blood and fear, now dictated its inexorable terms. One of the griffins, the very one that in its last surge had struck the harpy leader with its mighty wing, turned its huge, eagle-like, scar-covered head, in its golden, vertical pupil fixed on Iviell and her elves. There was no reading of voluntary consent, nor open refusal. There was only the cold, unerring calculation of a predator assessing the pack's chances of survival. It seemed to weigh in its mind the distance to the ominous ridge, the number of its wounded, combating capable kin, the fragile figures of the elves, and emitted a short, guttural, grating sound something between a crow's caw and a mountain lion's low growl. Then it slowly, overcoming obvious pain in its broken wing and torn flanks, lowered its powerful, lanai body even further, almost lying on its belly, and offered its broad, muscular back. It was an unprecedented gesture. Unthinkable, that they had no other choice but to accept this mute, heavy sacrifice. Very well, Quendeler said quietly, but clearly, and in his voice, usually devoid of emotion, sounded a deep, sorrowful gratitude. The old priest seemed to draw the last remnants of strength from the very stone beneath his feet, from the ancient memory of the earth. We will trust in their strength and honor, and in our own duty toward them. We will do what must be done. Reinl and Iviell, with the utmost, almost sacred care, trying not to cause the slightest extra pain, lifted the senseless, light-as-a-feather body of Iviell. The 2 other, less injured griffins, observing their kin's action, also, after a short pause, settled onto the stones, allowing the most weakened, flight-incapable hippogriffs whose wings were broken or whose legs trembled from blood loss, to be carefully laid upon their broad, warm backs. Iviell meanwhile approached the leader of the hippogriffs. It stood, planting its mighty, column-like legs on the stone, its bronze, thickly maned chest heaving heavily and raggedly. The wound on its side was tightly bound, but fresh, dark stains already seeped through the crude bandage. It inclined its large, intelligent head, and its curved beak with that familiar old scar nudged her shoulder softly, almost tenderly. In this simple gesture was contained all their shared, brief but intense history, instant trust, silent oath, blood spilled together on stones, and the common goal for which they both were now maimed, one physically, the other spiritually. "You can do it, my friend," she whispered, running her palm over its hot, sweat-damp neck beneath the thick mane. Her voice was quiet, but full of firm resolve. "All the way to the dwarven citadel, to Naruz-Damarak. There will be rest there, safety there. We'll make it." The leader answered her with a quiet, throaty, purring-like sound, unmistakable agreement and warm encouragement, as if to say it understood and was ready. The shrieking beyond the nearest ridge grew louder, more insistent, more aggressive. The Harpies had not left. They had gathered strength, drawn in new flocks, and now prepared for a decisive onslaught on the weakened quarry. "On the move, now," Iviell commanded, leaping onto the leader's back in one deft motion. To tear away from the earth this time was agonizingly hard, like rising from the ocean floor. The hippogriffs with exhausted bodies gained altitude with difficulty, with hoarse cries, their wings beating the air weakly and uncertainly. The griffins, burdened with unaccustomed living cargo, rose even harder, their mighty but wounded wings beating the air with a dull, heavy hum, and it seemed every muscle, every tendon in their colossal bodies groaned under an unbearable strain. They did not fly in the usual sense. They clawed their way into the cold black sky, carrying with them not only the physical weight of losses, but the heavy burden of pain, shame, and rage. Iviell, looking back, saw how from behind the dark ridge, like black, boiling lava, spilled an entire river of new, fresh harpies. They immediately spotted the slowly retreating quarry and with wild, triumphant cries gave chase, their wings flickering in the last rays of sunset. But the distance the elves and their beasts had already gained was significant, and the ascent for the pursuers, against a strong headwind blowing from the ravines. Moreover, the griffins, even gravely wounded, instinctively flew higher, using powerful updrafts inaccessible to the lighter, less enduring, and less experienced in high-altitude flight creatures. The chase, full of tension and freezing terror, lasted, fortunately, not long. Despairing of catching the elusive quarry and not risking climbing so high and far from their nests, the harpies gradually fell behind. Their furious cries grew softer, and finally they dissolved into the thickening dusk, like a terrible but fleeting nightmare from which they had managed to escape for a time. But the flight itself, freed from immediate pursuit, turned into a long, draining torture for every living being in this wounded squad. Each movement of huge wings echoed with sharp, gnawing pain and fresh wounds. The cold, thin air of the highlands lashed their faces, seeped under clothing, making them all huddle and shiver from the piercing chill. Iviell only gripped the leader's thick mane tighter, until her knuckles whitened, feeling beneath her how every muscle of its wounded mighty body strained and vibrated, how its breathing grew ever more hoarse, ragged, and labored. She looked ahead into the dark horizon, and mentally, desperately prayed to all the ancient forces of the world, all forgotten deities, that the dwarven stronghold of Naruz-Damarak was already near, just beyond the next ridge, that these exhausted bodies, had the last strength to make it, and that Iviell, silent, pale, and fragile on the broad back of an alien yet bearing colossus, would live. Hold on until that saving moment when the art of elven healers and druidic magic could return her to life. Behind, in a grim, stretched out line, the griffins swam heavily, gliding more than flying. Two of them, bowed by unbearable weight and pain, carried on their broad backs the helpless bodies of wounded hippogriffs, wrapped in cloak remnants. The sight was both pitiful and majestic, heartrending. Proud, unassailable lords of the sky, whose nature was the swift death-dyed fan, undisputed mastery over their domains, now performed the role of slow, ungainly, yet incredibly careful bearers. They flew heavily, their mighty wings beating the cold air with a deep, visceral hum like the groan of the earth, but they did not give up, did not sink. The third, the most cautious, bore the most precious cargo, the senseless, seemingly lifeless form of Iviell. It seemed to understand the fragility and importance of its burden instinctively. Its flight was astonishingly smooth. Almost weightless, it caught the slightest steady currents, skillfully avoiding turbulence and air pockets, moving with a stony, almost ritual slowness and precision, as if carrying not an elf mate, but a precious, sacred vessel not to be spilled. Rhinal, flying on her own wounded hippogriff beside this colossus, never took her eyes off it, or rather, off that bundle on its back. Her own weariness, her fear, her pain all receded, compressed into one tight knot before the single, all-consuming task. Just to make it, in her battered saddlebag, besides meager personal supplies, lay carefully hoarded remnants from Lendern of the strongest healing herbs, resins, and balms. They were pitifully few, and their power was not limitless, but they offered that weak, barely smoldering spark of hope in the darkness, to which she clung with all the strength of her weary soul. Aileran Orlin, flying on the wounded flanks of this flying island of pain, had become silent. Dark shadows, their movements, usually so precise and sharp, had grown slow, sluggish reaction dulled, as if they swam through thick honey. They clung only by the last, nearly exhausted threads of consciousness, mechanically scanning the surrounding gloom for new, invisible threats, but in the eyes of both, beneath half-closed lids, stood a dull, animal, all-consuming weariness stronger than any fear. Talos, seated behind Quendeler on one of the most enduring and calm hippogriffs, seemed even more merged with the surrounding wild nature than usual. His face was the color of cold ashes, but his slender, tail fingers gripping the staff laid across his knees spasmodically clenched its haft. From time to time, and then the crystal at its tip answered with a weak, tired green spark. This was not magic in the usual sense, but pure, fierce life affirmation, the last will to exist, fueled only by his own unbroken spirit. Lariel flew in silence, absolutely mute, like a ghost. Her hippogriff, though wounded in the shoulder, held steady and even. She did not move, uttered no sound, no moan. Her silver hair, usually bound, now streamed in the icy wind like a wild halo, and her gaze, empty and unseeing, was fixed somewhere in the space before her, as if she looked not at the black cliff sliding past, but into some inner, bottomless void of her own grief and detachment. The hours of this nightmarish flight merged into one viscous, endless, boundaryless instant where there was no past, no future, only the present suffering. Constellations, usually so clear and bright in the mountain sky, hid behind tatter, low clouds. Only rarely, through their rents, like holes in a blanket, flickered the cold, lonely spark of a distant star, giving neither warmth nor hope. The night stretched, seeming an eternity, and strength began to leave even the staunchest and most enduring. One of the hippogriffs carried on a griffin's back suddenly emitted a quiet, plaintive, almost childish moan, and went completely limp for an instant, its head dangling helplessly. The griffin bearing it, sensing a dangerous shift in balance, lurched heavily, roughly in the air, nearly losing equilibrium. But, gathering will, with a deep growl it righted its flight and emitted a short, commanding roar full of primal, broking no argument authority, at which even the dying, fainting hippogriff instinctively fell silent, submitting to this stronger will. Lariel felt in that same moment how beneath her the leader suddenly jerked sharply, with its whole body, as if struck by an invisible blow. Her heart plummeted into an icy abyss. She pressed her lips to its neck, to the warm, ruffled feathers beneath the mane. Just a little more, only a little, she whispered right into its skin, and her voice, usually so firm, broke, became hoarse and pleading. Please, just a bit more. We're almost there. The leader answered her not with sound, but with action. It seemed to have heard her, or simply found in the depths of its animal being some unknown, last reserve. Gathering the remnants of strength into a knot, it straightened its listing flight and, overcoming wild pain, gained a little more speed, stretching forward. It was the gesture of a true leader, understanding to the marrow that if it, the leader, gave up now and fell, then after it would collapse, like a house of cards, this whole long, exhausted chain of wounded souls trailing behind in the night. And then, as if in answer to this last, desperate will, ahead, in a black, yawning cleft between two rock giants, there finally opened not the stronghold's heart itself, but its mighty, grim antechamber. Not Naru's Demerik itself, hidden in the mountain's deepest depths, but that place where its hidden power prepared to emerge, to receive its defenders. They began to descend, clinging with fogged gazes to details snatched from the morning darkness by lights. The steppe valley now resembled a stirred-up anthill, fiercely illuminated by hundreds of points of living fire. The flames of torches and campfires tore from the general gloom the main sights. The colossal, motionless, seemingly asleep on their feet silhouettes of the hawks, standing in strict, almost military order, like stone colossi ready to unload their precious cargo. Above, on dark ledges and outcrops, darkening, merging with the rock, were the figures of Griffins, silent, eternal sentinels, their golden eyes coldly, disinterestedly, reflecting the gleam of fires below. And between these two giant worlds, on the very earth, elves of Lendern already swarmed like industrious ants. Work had only just begun, and in that was its own chaos. With hollow thuds and metallic clangs, complex systems of straps and nets were undone from mighty, dust-coated backs of hawks onto stony, uneven ground descended, raising clouds of dust. The first heavy bales, barrels of water, rolled up tents, and crates of supplies. This was not an organized, ceremonial reception, but the spontaneous, painful birth of a military bridgehead, chaotic, hurried, yet full of unquenchable, purposeful energy. The air in the valley hummed not with resonant voices, but with the dry, business-like sounds of heavy labor, the screech of metal on metal, dull thuds of wood on stone, terse, hoarse commands that immediately drowned in the general roar. Their wounded, barely breathing squat, like the last, dying mountains exhaled speck, slowly, uncertainly settled on a free, abandoned scrap of land away from the main chaos of unloading. The landing was not soft, but heavy, rough, almost a crash. The Griffins carrying the wounded crashed onto sharp stones with a dull, crushing thud, their wings helplessly splayed on the ground like broken sails. The leader of the Hippogriffs, taking a last, almost falling step, froze in place, lowering its proud head low from its cracked beak slowly, drop by drop, seeped and fell onto the stones a heavy, dark, almost black fluid. Iviell almost tumbled, rather than jumped, from its back. Her whole body was numb from long tension and cold. A continuous, high ringing stood in her ears. But her eyes, accustomed to darkness, immediately found the only important target, that very griffin which had with unnatural, touching care crouched low, allowing Iviell and Orlin, barely staying on their feet, to lift Iviell's senseless, wrapped body from its broad back. Iviell was already there, her face twisted with quiet, inner panic. But her hands acted quickly and precisely. She was already undoing fastenings on the elf maid's chest, trying to reach the wound, assess the damage. No one from the swarming mass of elves around rushed to meet them, offered help. Their arrival, so dramatic and tragic, went completely unnoticed in the general, clattering hubbub of the giant aerial convoys unloading. Help! Here! Need help now! Iviell's voice broke on the first try, sounding hoarse, inconspicuous, and powerless in the general deafening din. She took a deep, lung-burning breath and repeated, not shouting now, but giving an order, addressing her own, the few who could still move and understand. Talos, Quendeler, Iviell, speak, what's her condition? Alive. She herself, staggering as if drunk with weariness and pain, ran to the leader. Its deep, gaping wound oozed dark, thick blood through the soaked-through bandage. It breathed heavily, hoarsely, its mighty, bronze flank heaved like a bellows, and each breath came with visible, agonizing effort. Nearby, one of the Griffins, the very one that had carried the wounded Hippogriff, groaned quietly, in an animal way, trying to reach with its tongue a deep, ragged tear on its own wing, but couldn't. In the air between them hung not the triumph of long-awaited arrival, but the bitter, pressing, unadorned reality. They had miraculously made it, but now, on this cold ground, they had to survive, and for that, what was desperately needed here, in this hubbub, was what was not yet present: organized aid, medicine, a safe, warm place. Not this wind-swept scrap of earth. Iviell, tearing her bloodied palm from the hot, shuddering flank of the leader, met the gaze of Talos as he approached. The druid, leaning heavily on his staff, was already looking toward the elves, among whom flickered not the gleaming armor of warriors, but robes of another, modest cut of sturdy, undyed cloth the color of earth and moss, embroidered with fine patterns depicting the interweaving of roots and leaves. Druids of the eternal forest, the Hippogriffs and Griffins. Talos's voice sounded quiet, strained, but with that undeniable, natural clarity that brooked no argument, and in his eyes flashed a weak but firm hope. They will help, only they have the strength and knowledge for such deep healing, the strength of life itself. He did not wait for her answer or approval, gathering into a fist the last crumbs of his own, almost exhausted strength. Overcoming his limp and dizziness, he moved toward the nearest group of druids, his staff in hand pulsing weakly but persistently with a tired green light, like a beacon for his own kind. Quendaler, silently observing this mute scene, nodded slowly, heavily, as if confirming the druid's words. His old, wise gaze, having seen the circles of ages, had already assessed and weighed everything. He approached Iviell, and his quiet voice, full of indisputable, fatherly resolve, sounded clearly. "We need to go inside," he said, and in these simple words there was no place for doubt. "Iviell, they will help in the stone halls, and all the other wounded will be better off there than here, in the open wind." He looked over those still on their feet, Taylor with his stern, frozen face, Orlin's pale, but collected, bowstring-tough face, Lariel's empty, detached, yet still obedient eyes. These were still warriors, though worn to the limit. They could carry. They had to carry. The decision was made without extra words, almost instinctively, like the last act of will of drowning people. Taylor and Orlin, exchanging a glance, again, with the utmost, almost sacred care, approached Ivill's body and, fashioning from interlocked, trembling with weariness hands and hastily removed, still warm cloaks, improvised stretchers, lifted her. Rhinel immediately positioned herself beside them, not taking her eyes from her friend's waxen face, her fingers continuing to clutch spasmodically a small vial with the remnants of precious healing tincture, like a last, desperate talisman against death. Iviell, before moving to follow, cast a last, guilt and pain-filled glance at her hippogriff. It, as if sensing, slowly turned its head. In its tired but incredibly intelligent eyes was no mute plea to stay. There was only complete, deep understanding. It emitted a short, throaty, farewell-like sound, sending her away. "Go. Fulfill your duty to the others. We will manage." Beside it, already bent to calm, confident figures in simple druid cloaks, their hands, traced with tattoos like tree rings and shoots, lay soft but firm on its bloodied, shuddering flank, and from their touch went a weak, vivifying, golden light smelling of moss and rain. Turning on the move, Iviell saw how to the other wounded hippogriffs and griffins, sprawled on the stones. Other nature wardens approached. It was a different kind of aid, not fussy, not panicked, but deep, concentrated, quiet, as if the ancient, eternal forests themselves stretched their invisible roots here, across mountains and abysses, to nourish, calm mutilated life, pour new strength into it. And then the squad, or rather what remained of it, Quendaler, Iviell, Taylor, Orlin, Rhinel weeping aloud, and silent as a shadow, Ariel moved away from the nosy, fiery bridgehead, away from the light of campfires and the deafening roar of thousands of voices. They went toward the black, silent, yawning maw in the very rock, toward the giant gates of Nar-Uz-Dum-Rak. They carried with them news of the Allies' arrival and the heavy, fragile, terrible burden of others' pain and their own deep, bone-deep weariness. Step by step, leaving behind light, bustle, and the beginning hell of war, they entered the cold, stone womb of the mountain, toward the ghostly hope of salvation hidden in its impregnable, grim, eternal depths, while this small, sorrowful, slowly moving procession dissolved in the cold, damp gloom of the mountain tunnel. The giant, soulless mechanism on the external bridgehead continued its work, not slowing, not paying them heed. The chaotic unloading gradually turned into a coordinated, though feverishly hurried, complex dance. The elves, driven by desperate purposefulness, no longer just dumped bales, but rolled and dragged them to predetermined, pre-marked places, creating the first clear outlines of future storehouses, smithy areas, and field infirmaries. The ring of metal, the thud of wood, and the hum of hundreds of voices merged into a single, powerful, unceasing roar that drowned even the quiet moans of the wounded and death rattles. The hawks, having fulfilled their titanic, silent service, froze in utter immobility. They seemed to have turned into ancient stone statues carved by forgotten gods in an era when the world was younger and harsher. Their mighty, row-dust-covered bodies did not flinch when the last complex harnesses, woven of strongest elven fiber, were undone by deft, weary hands. The last heavy bale, emitting a dull, final thud, landed on the stony, uneven ground. And then, without a single sound, without a visible command or cry, they all moved as one. There was no swift takeoff, there was a majestic, powerful push from the earth with huge, clawed paws. Their colossal, broad, and perfect wings, capable of soaring for months in the highest air layers, stirred whole clouds of dust and small stones, swirling them into miniature sand devils, one after another, with the same unhurried, indifferent, unearthly smoothness. They turned their bulky bodies, woven of muscle, tendon, and patience, and began slowly, inexorably to gain altitude. They departed back into their misty, silent, distant lot, into the heights over the expanses of the misty lowlands from whence they had come. High on the cliffs and ledges, on dark outcrops carved by wind and time, perched the griffins of the gray peaks. They did not follow the hawks. They sat immobile, like dark, animated bas-reliefs of the mountain itself, part of its stone flesh and spirit. Their golden, lidless eyes, usually shining with the cold, predatory detachment of lords of the skypaths, now watched the bustle below with intense, assessing attention. Their gaze was devoid of former hauteur and it was read a tense curiosity. They peered into the chaos of the bridgehead, as if trying to decipher the essence of these new, strange allies with whom they, it seemed, were now bound to meet the bloody dawn of the coming war. They saw not just disorderly milling. Their sharp, illusion-free gaze discerned the thin but strongest web of bonds that had arisen in battles, crucible and been cemented by shared, burning pain. They saw with their own unblinking eyes how a druid of the eternal forest, in a simple moss and earth-colored cloak, knelt beside a hippogriff whose neck was laid open by a terrible, ragged wound, saw how slender, pattern-tattooed fingers resembling tree rings softly lay on bloodied flesh, and saw the miracle how under that touched the wound began slowly to close not with a scar, but with living, softly golden glowing tissue. It seemed the very moss, lichen, and pure, untarnished strength of the earth rose from the stone to cover the suffering, return wholeness to flesh. They saw how another elf in gleaming armor, with a face weary from one loading and setting up camp, approached a limping griffin whose wing dragged unnaturally on the ground. The elf took his field flask from his belt and, without hesitation, brought it to the colossus's beak, letting it take several long draughts before bringing the flask to his own parched, cracked lips. And they saw the silent, deep understanding flickering in the intelligent, suffering eyes of that hippogriff leader. Overcoming the hellish pain from its own gaping wound, it gathered the remnants of will and, step by step, slowly and solemnly walked around its lying, groaning kin. It touched each with its beak on the forehead, on the shoulder, and in this ancient gesture of a leader checking the pack, comforting it and affirming its unshakable presence, was all the wisdom and sorrow of their herd. This was no simple formal contract sealed on the cold gray peaks. This was something more ancient and fundamental, rooted in the very darkest and brightest origins of life itself. It was the silent acknowledgement of shared fury, of blood spilled together, scarlet and dark, and of joints standing at the very brink of doom, when the breath of death was felt by every being. The Harpies were a threat not only to the Elves and their hippogriffs, they were corruption, a disease for the very sky, for the aerial roots, for the sacred nests built in impregnable clefts. Those blind in their hatred creatures had attacked them too. The griffins dug into their flesh with sharp, filthy claws, and the elves and their winged steeds in that hell had not simply defended. Each for their own separate life they had flung themselves into the very furnace to save each other. A griffin, covering with its body a falling, crippled hippogriff, taking upon itself blows meant for another. An elf, darting under a hail of claws to defend a comrade already almost dragged into the abyss, risking the next instant to be torn apart. For the griffins, whose wild, harsh world for centuries had been built solely on the immutable laws of brute force, absolute inviolability of their territory, and the undisputed talon right of the strongest, all this was a revelation overturning age-old foundations. They saw now that strength, it turns out, does not always lie merely in dominating and subjugating, ruling and taking. Sometimes true, deep strength, the kind that withstands death's very onslaught, resides elsewhere in being ready, at the needed moment, without thought, to cover with one's own back, one's own wing, the one fighting beside you, even if it is of another herd, chatters in another tongue, and its blood smells different. This was not sudden sentimentality or an attack of kindness foreign to predators. No, it was a cold, predatory, unerring calculation, but a calculation of the highest strategic order, dictated by the very instinct of survival. The war advancing from the east, already announcing itself with crimson, poisonous flares on the horizon, promised to be a war not for trophies or lands, but a war of total and irrevocable annihilation of all that breathes differently, thinks differently, lives differently. Against such absolute, blind, all-consuming threat, their isolated, proud, but lonely might could prove fragile as the first ice on a spring stream that melts under its own weight, but at the same time, that fragile, hard one. Tain-shan courage-shan mu-trust woven mutual aid between elves, hippogriffs, and now their wounded kinnet offered a different, unexpected chance. A chance not merely to survive alone, hiding in their heights, but together, back to back, wing to wing, to defend their inalienable right to exist before the face of blind extermination. And so they had stayed. Not as temporary allies, misfortune bound only by common danger. They stayed as an independent, formidable, and indomitable force which, having recognized the unexpected, immutable value of this new, fire and suffering-born bond, inwardly, in the depths of its predatory essence, had decided that its true place henceforth was precisely here, on this scrap of stone under the open sky, beside these strange, fragile, and incredibly stubborn beings. They stayed because they saw in this chaotic, bustling, nosy bridgehead not just another military camp erected in haste and fear, but a living, trembling, darely sprouted seed of something new, something worth defending not only with claws and beak, but even at the cost of their own ancient, proud, and solitary impregnability. And at that time, the gloom of the tunnel, cut like a wound into the very thickness of the dragon's ridge, swallowed the elven squat ever deeper. This was not merely darkness, the absence of sun or torchlight. It was a dense, almost tangible substance, having absorbed the age-old, bone-chilling cold of stone saturated with underground moisture, the smell of rocklay, the heavy reek of oxidized metal emanating from ancient ores, and the distant but stubborn, acrid stench of smithy forges drifting from the stronghold's depths. The walls, carved with rough, angular runes, absorbed every sound with insatiable, greedy force. Even the heavy, hoarse and pain-filled breathing of the bearers, even the grating of their boots on fine stone grit, even choked moans seemed muffled, coming as if from beneath the earth's thickness, from another, dead world. Only in places, at great intervals, was this impenetrable murk broken by islands of light. The light of torches, locked in black, soot-grimed iron brackets driven into the wall with crude force, did not dispel the darkness, but only tore from it with greedy, uneven tongues of flame separate, deceptive scraps of reality. Suddenly, a polished over the ages facet of a granite column was revealed to the gaze. Moisture beaded on. Stone glinted dully distorted. Mad shadows danced, lengthening and shortening, mingling and tearing in time with the fire's crackle. Between these rare oases of light lay bottomless gulfs of blackness, even thicker from contrast, where steps grew uncertain, and imagination painted moving outlines in the void. In this flickering, deceptive half-gloom, their sorrowful procession resembled a ghostly, silent march of souls returning from the shadowy realm where there is neither sun, nor songs, nor warm hope in the breast. Iviell walked ahead, her step setting a slow, inexorable tempo, her back, always straight, proud, and unbending, like the shaft of a battle standard that does not bow even under hurricane winds, now bore an invisible but terrible weight from which even steel rods bend and break. Behind her, moving their legs in sync like soldiers at a funeral, Iviell and Orlin bore the stretched-out cloak turned into primitive, pitiful stretchers. On it, as on a bier, lay Iviell, her face, usually animated by a mocking smile or healer's concentrated anger, now white, smooth, and motionless, like a marble mask forever frozen on the countenance of a breathless statue. Muscles on the bearer's arms, bulged and rippled under skin from unbearable tension. Tendons stretched like strings about to snap, but their faces remained frozen, cast from the same dark, impenetrable stone as the tunnel wall's stone masks hiding everything in the world. Weariness, despair, fear. In them was read only one thing: an iron, almost mad will to hold on and not fall, not release from their hands this fragile burden. Quendeler strode beside, leaning heavily on his simple wooden staff with each step. His tread was slow, measured, but not aged weighty. Solemn, like the step of a supreme judge entering the place where fate's final and merciless sentence has already been passed. His eyes, having seen sunrises and sunsets of whole epochs, absorbed the overwhelming, ancient might of the underworld without condemnation, but without the slightest trace of fear, only with cold, clear understanding of where they had all now entered. Iviell walked, not taking her eyes from the pale as wax face of the wounded elf maid, and in her eyes, full of unused tears, stood an emptiness more terrible and bottomless than any physical pain. And Iviell's shadow mutely closed the procession, absolutely silent, detached from everything, as if her true essence, her very soul, had remained there, on the ice-wine-swept, blood-soaked plateau, among the breathless bodies of fallen griffins, and now into the tunnel walked only her empty, body-obedient shell. Thank you for your attention. Please like and subscribe so you don't miss the next part and chapter.